Welcome to the Lubar Center at Marquette Law School, home of, among many things, the Marquette Law School Poll. And we are here today with Professor Charles Franklin, the director of the poll. We are releasing the first of two rounds of results from the latest round of a nationwide poll that we did. This is the 12th time we have done a nationwide poll, mostly related to the Supreme Court, dating back to 2019. And dare I say, it's become one of the best and increasingly widely noted gauges of public sentiment in relation to the U.S. Supreme Court particularly. So we will begin with talking to Professor Franklin about the mechanics of this round of the poll.
So this is a national sample of 1,000 adults in all 50 states. We were in the field January 9th through the 20th this year, and the poll has a margin of error of plus or minus 3.8 percentage points.
And focusing on the list of questions related to the Supreme Court, what's the main theme that you came up with here?
Well, we're going to start off with approval of the court because that's inched up a little bit. 47% of adults approve of the job the court's doing, 53% disapprove. And approval of the court's been rising pretty steadily since its recent low point, down at 38% in July. It's still well below the 60% that it hit as recently as July of 2021. But what we've seen in recent months is a pattern where approval of the court has dipped down after the court's made some decisions that obviously were unpopular, but then over the next few months, approval inches back up. But then when we had the leak of the Dobbs decision last May, approval tipped down, then the release of the actual decision in June led to it dropping to that 38% in July. Since then, it's crept back up from 38 to 40 to 44 to now 47. And I think what you're seeing here in part is due to the episodic nature of coverage of the court. The way we hear news, we see news, we pay attention to the court when it's made a major decision. But in between those times, the court's not in our day-to-day media diet the way the president or Congress might be. And that lack of news seems to benefit the court as its approval inches up until the next round of decisions. We do see some partisan differences now. In fact, quite a bit. Of Republicans, 67% approve, Independents 42%, and Democrats 35%. Quite substantial, quite low number for Democrats. But if we just go back to that July of 2021 reading, so not that long ago, there was almost no partisan difference. Republicans approved at 57%, Independents at 61%, Democrats at 59%. So I think you see in this sharp polarization now, compared to 18 months ago or so, how much controversial decisions become polarized along party lines and produce a polarization with respect to the court that starts to look a bit like polarization with respect to other institutions.
In fact, maybe this is a slight digression, the Dobbs decision and the whole abortion issue did have political fallout. It's one case where the court connected with voters.
Yes, very much so. And we see that in a couple of ways. First of all, we saw it in the elections this fall. That's the most direct way. But we also see that it contributed to this growing polarization because approval of the court among Republicans moved up in the aftermath of Dobbs and has been steadily in the mid-60s to the low 70s in recent months. In contrast, independents took a pretty sharp downward turn after the Dobbs decision was released, as did Democrats. But Democratic approval fell all the way to 15% in July of last year, 2022, has since inched back up to currently 35%, so actually a 20% recovery among Democrats. So even though they remain very negative about the court, they're not as negative as they were in the immediate aftermath of the Dobbs decision.
So how aware are people as a whole of what the court is doing? And we'll get into some specific cases that are pending before the court or recently decided by the court.
Right. I think there are a couple of ways to look at this. First of all, as we just saw in approval, most people are willing to say whether they have approval, they approve or disapprove of the job the court's doing. But that doesn't mean they're paying attention to the day-to-day business of the court, pending cases, and things like that. This goes back to that point about coverage of the court is episodic. And so people hear about the court, maybe when a case, certainly when a case is decided, maybe when the case is argued. You certainly hear about the court when a vacancy occurs and we're going through the nomination process. But between those times, not so much. So you see that in a couple of ways in this survey. We asked, how much have you heard about a Supreme Court case concerning the use of race in college admissions, which is one of the major cases before the court? 47% said 17% said they'd heard or read a lot about such a case. 47% had heard a little, and 36% had heard nothing at all. So we're really looking at less than 20% that say they've heard a lot about this, though the 47% in the middle may have heard, at least as they say, a little here. Another case before the court is concerns state legislatures and how much power they have to control and set the rules for federal elections. That case was argued December 7th before the court, and there was a fair bit of news coverage over that argument. But as of January, 16% said they'd heard a lot about that case, 46 a little, 38 nothing at all. Pretty similar to the affirmative action case. Now, not every case is that invisible, which brings us back.
Name one.
Let's name Dobbs, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
Same question, how much have you heard about the Dobbs decision? In July, shortly after the decision, 81% said they'd heard a lot, 15% a little, and 3% nothing at all. We asked that 3 more times during the fall, the last time in November, and awareness of the decision remained quite high. Even in November, 76% still said they'd heard a lot about that case, 20% a little, and 3% nothing. We didn't repeat it this month. So the point here is there are exceptional cases that the court hears that become almost universally known and attract a lot of attention, and as we saw through the fall, political controversy in elections and other things. Many cases that deal with very important public policy questions or legal questions, like affirmative action, like the role and power of state legislatures, on the other hand, manage to fly below the radar for almost everyone simply because they don't get a lot of news coverage and they deal with topics that, until people are reminded of them, are not really on the top of their minds.
One of the things we've asked about consistently in this dozen times of polling nationwide is whether people know whether a Democratic or Republican president named the majority of current justices. And that's I think, I don't want to speak for you, but I think that that's kind of a proxy for what do they know in general about the court. So what's the status of that question?
Well, you speak for me on this, because
okay.
I do think this is one measure that's, sort of baseline knowledge of the court, not about a particular case that you might or might not have heard of, but what do you know about the structure of the court? And given how controversial appointments have been, given how the Senate in particular has dealt with nominations over the last decade or so, you would surely think that knowledge of which party had nominated the majority of the court would be something that folks would pay attention to, or would know if they were paying any attention to the court. Well, what we find is the folks with very, well, let's say incorrect knowledge, the people who believe that Democratic presidents appointed a majority of the court, has barely changed since 2019 when we first asked this question. Back then, 27% thought that Democratic presidents had appointed the majority. Today, it's 23%. So only a small decline in that misinformation, sort of a recollecting the Supreme Court of the Warren Court quite a long time ago. On the other hand, over this time, the percent saying there's definitely a majority that were appointed by Republican presidents has almost doubled. That was 19% in 2019, and it's climbed to 36% now. So there has been a substantial amount of increased knowledge of the composition of the court by appointing president. On the other hand, it is 36% that are sure about that. 41% say they think Republican presidents reported a majority of them probably did. So there's still some wiggle room there. If you want to see the glass mostly full, that gives you 77% that get the appointing majority right. On the other hand, it's just barely a third that are pretty confident about that.
And to note, as a factual matter, the answer is that 6 of the current justices were appointed by Republican presidents and 3 by Democratic presidents.
For our fine audience, I don't think we need
that
to
could be
do
true,
that, but
but
absolutely right.
Just like to speak to the facts occasionally. And there are partisan aspects of awareness of the court majorities.
Which I think are kind of interesting. Among Republicans, 34% say there's definitely a Republican majority of appointed justices. 26% say Democratic majority. But Democrats are actually more aware of the party majority. 46% say a Republican-appointed majority, 16% say a Democratic one. So there are some partisan differences, and it's sort of striking that the party whose president appointed the last 3 members of the court, cementing that 6-3 majority, those partisans are actually a little less aware of that, even though we heard throughout the Trump administration, but it's all about the judges. You know, appointments to judicial offices are one of the more important things that the president nominates, the Senate confirms, and partisan debate has been intense about it. You might think that there would be more knowledge of this. On the other hand, let's come back to the half full glass. The percent getting that question right has almost doubled in the last 3 years.
So let's talk about some of the cases that are pending before the court or that have been recently decided.
Yep. All pending this time. Well, we will get to some recent decided too. So we're looking at 3 major cases before the court. One concerns the use of race in admissions to colleges. One concerns whether a business can decline services to LGBTQ customers, and one deals with the power of state legislatures to control federal elections. when we look at these, first of all, it's important to know how many people haven't formed an opinion about them. So on the case of race in college admissions, 49% say they haven't heard enough about the case to have an opinion on it. 35% favor a ban on the use of race, and 16% would oppose a ban on the use of race. If we look just at those people who have heard of and have an opinion about the case, then it's 68% favoring a ban on the use of race, 32% opposed. So we have a high percentage without an opinion and lower percentages of and of those with an opinion, a very lopsided view, but half haven't formed an opinion about this case.
Let's break that down a little further here, including by race itself.
Right. So by race, again, there's high percentage that haven't heard enough to have an opinion. Among white respondents, 44% have not heard enough. Among black respondents, 54%, and among Hispanics, 55%. So fairly similar levels of awareness. Those, on balance, each of those groups favors a ban on the use of race, but there are racial differences. 42% of whites favor a ban, 24% of blacks, and 30% of Hispanics. But that's a little bit more, even in the case of black respondents in particular, where 24% would favor a ban, 21% would oppose a ban. If we just look at those with an opinion, then 75% of whites, 53% of black people, and 67% of Hispanic respondents favor a ban on the use of race. There are also big party differences on this with, again, similar levels of knowledge across party, but among those with an opinion, 86% of Republicans favor banning the use of race, 72% of independents, and 44% of Democrats, but a majority of Democrats with an opinion, 56%, are opposed to banning the use of race in admissions.
Another case with the interesting name of 303 Creative versus Elinas. 303 Creative, I believe, is a designer of wedding materials.
Websites, yes.
Online.
Yep.
Involves religious beliefs or free speech rights. Is the woman who runs this website, can she refuse to serve LGBTQ customers?
Right. And 43% say they haven't heard enough to have an opinion about this. 24% would favor the website designer having the right to refuse services, but 33% would oppose denying services. When we look again at just those who have an opinion, 43% favor providing this, whether it's free speech or religious objection to rule, but 57% favor the rights of the customers, the LGBTQ customers. So again, lots of undecideds, lots of haven't heard enough about that. Nevertheless, a balance in favor of the rights of LGBTQ people over the rights of the business owner. Sorry.
Go ahead.
There is some relationship here as well to how you feel about same-sex marriage, because what role that plays in this ruling. Of those who favor same-sex marriage, 22% favor the business owner being able to deny services, but 78% are opposed. Of that group that are opposed to the court's same-sex marriage ruling, 88% favor the business owner's rights, and just 12% favor the customer's rights. So we see that across this dimension of same-sex marriage, gay and lesbian rights, that the earlier decision on same-sex marriage also is related to how people see this issue.
Third case that's pending before the court currently is the so-called independent state legislature matter.
Yes, this is Moore versus Harper and deals with whether a state legislature can legislate to regulate federal elections more or less without the intervention of any other government authority, including potentially state courts. This decision, or this argument rather, was heard on December 7th. Here especially, most people have not heard of this decision. 69% have not heard enough to have an opinion about this case. Just 9% favor a ruling that state legislatures do have sole authority over elections, while 22% are opposed. Given so many, 69% without an opinion, we're really looking at a small minority that have views on this, though of those with a view, 28% favor the power of the legislatures, 72% are opposed to that.
And then we turn to a couple prior decisions, things that actually have been decided, of which the first is the Dobbs case.
Case. Again, we continue to follow this and how people feel about it. In this January survey, 35% favor that decision in Dobbs that struck down or overturned Roe versus Wade. 64% are opposed to that. This has not changed very much since November, when 33% approved of the Dobbs decision, 66% were opposed. We mentioned a minute ago the same-sex marriage ruling. We also asked about that, and in this most recent survey, 67% approve of that or favor that ruling establishing a right to marriage. 33% are opposed to it.
Which still remains an amazing change in American public opinion if you look across time.
It absolutely does. One of the most striking changes in the long term in public opinion, and especially how steady this shift over time was on that issue.
The ideology of the court, how do people describe it?
Perceptions of the court have moved substantially in a conservative direction since 2019, when we started asking this question. In this survey, 59% describe the court as very conservative or conservative, and that compares to just 38% in September of 2019. Likewise, the percent seeing the court as moderate has declined significantly from 50% to 31%. Not surprisingly, very few people see the court as predominantly liberal, 10% either liberal or very liberal. So I think the last 3 years since we started this survey, 3.5 years, almost 3.5 years now, has shown that the drift in perception of the court is pretty substantial, moving from a large percentage of the public seeing a moderate institution to one that shifted a bit to the right, and now at 59% conservative or very conservative, further shifts to the right over the last few years.
And is, if I may say so, based in reality, given the 3 Trump-appointed justices who joined the court, it is a more conservative group. That's just like true.
So for the things that we said at the beginning about lack of knowledge and familiarity with the details of the court, that is simultaneously true with the perception of the court drifting. Also, of course, if we sliced our data and only looked at the people who were pretty knowledgeable of the court, we would see a somewhat different picture than if we look at the folks who only episodically pay attention to the court. But on the big picture of what's shifted in the court, I think you'd say the public largely gets that story right, even if they're more than a little fuzzy on some of the details.
The Dobbs case is one where the majority decision was clearly not in line with the majority of public opinion. To what degree do people think public opinion should influence the court?
Yeah, this is one where opinion has flipped. Back in 2020, we first asked, should the Supreme Court consider a public opinion about a case in reaching decisions? And at that point, 44% said they should consider a public opinion, and a majority, 55%, said they should ignore public opinion. Those numbers have virtually flipped in over time, and in this month's survey. This month, 56% say they should consider public opinion, 44% say they should not. Again, I think this reflects the fact that when the court rules in a direction that a majority of the public opposes, as we saw in the Dobbs case, the public thinks maybe they should have a little more of a voice in those things. Still, it's notable that that's 56% that say yes and 44% that say public opinion should not play a role. So this is a bit of a split, but it's not a lopsided split.
The role of precedent
Yeah.
in court decisions.
This, too, is one that has shifted a little bit. By and large, the public overwhelmingly says that the court should be willing to reverse previous decisions if a majority of the court believes the case was wrongly decided. If we go back to September 2020, 18% said the court should follow precedent, should follow previous decisions whenever possible. 81% said they should overturn cases they thought were wrong. That's gone up to 28% that say follow precedent now, and 72% that say they should overturn wrong decisions. There was a little bit of a tick up in this in July, right after the Dobbs decision, where following precedent was part of the argument in that case. There, follow precedent went up to 33% and overturn wrong decisions 66%. So we do see some movement on this in response to events and the arguments about cases. Again, it's doubtful that people outside the legal community wake up every morning worrying about whether precedent will be followed or not. But here again, you see that the public did shift a little bit in response to events surrounding that Dobbs decision.
And what motivates justices? This is something we've asked about quite a bit over the
and we've seen some pretty substantial shifts in this. The question we use is, in general, what most often motivates Supreme Court justices' decisions? Is it mainly politics or mainly the law? And in September of 2019, 35% said mainly politics, 64% mainly the law. In this January poll, it's evenly split. 49% say mainly politics, 51% say mainly the law. So there has been a pretty sharp movement in that, and that movement is mostly in calendar year 2022, where we started to see this shift, though the shift came before the Dobbs decision came down or was leaked, so it predated Dobbs.
How confident are people in the court? And then the second part of the discussion is compared to other institutions.
There's been a little shift, as you might expect, given the changes we've seen in approval. Back in 2019, 37% had a great deal of confidence or a lot of confidence, and 20% had little or none. Now it's 31% a great deal, down 6 points, and 31% little or none, up 11 points. So there has been some shifting, and there's 38% in the middle who say they have some confidence. The court fits sort of towards the upper middle, if I can use such a term, compared to other institutions. The institution with the most confidence are the police, or is the police. 50%, a great deal, 21%, little or none. Sorry, a great deal or quite a lot, 21%, little or none. Then there's a drop to the FBI, 39%, a great deal or a lot, and pretty closely followed by the U.S. Supreme Court, 31%, a lot. Also, your state Supreme Court also gets 31% saying they have a lot of confidence. Then there's a drop off to the presidency, though there we've seen partisanship plays such a powerful role depending on who's in the office. Your state legislature, 25% have a lot of confidence. And finally, Congress, everybody's least favorite institution.
Don't get no respect.
13% say they have a lot of confidence in Congress. The last thing we asked about is trust in government. This is the question of how much of the time do you think you can trust the government in Washington to do what's right? This is a question that dates back to the early 1960s when we had a whole lot of confidence in government. Those days are long past us. Confidence declined through the 60s in the turmoil of civil unrest, the civil rights movement, Vietnam War, then fell again in Watergate, and in the years since has just continued down. We say that here. As of January, 1% say they think they can trust the government just about all the time. 20% say most of the time. But then it's 61% only some of the time and 16% never. So we do have in this trust or confidence in institutions, at the very best, we have a lot of people sort of in the middle saying they have some confidence in institutions and some, or not very much, trust. But we also have almost 20% at each end of a fair bit of confidence and none at all.
We will be back. This will be on Thursday, January 26th. We'll be bringing you the second part of the results from this round of polling, largely dealing with national political issues. Further details of how this poll was done, the questions, and a large volume of details on the answers can be found at law.marquette.edu/poll. And thank you to Professor Charles Franklin for guiding us through this round of results. We're trying to do these national Supreme Court focus polls every 2 months, so I bet we'll be back, sometime in March.
I think so.
Just projecting out here. Thank you for joining us.